Very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ISA's seminar titled The Young in South Asia, Will They Transform Economic Possibilities for Asia and the World? Please note that today's seminar is being live streamed on ISA's Facebook page. Before we proceed, may I request everyone to keep your mobile phones and other electronic devices in silent mode. Today's seminar will be delivered by Professor Jain Jose Thomas, Professor of Economics at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. The seminar will be chaired by Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead Trade and Economics at ISAS in US. I shall now hand over the floor to Dr. Palit to begin the proceedings.
Thank you so much, Divya. And firstly, welcome, Jen. And I think I would like to share this with all of you here that Jen was one of the earliest research faculties of ISAS. That was probably when during 2005-06.
2005 to 8.
Yeah. So in a sense that we are all following him. So thank you so much for visiting us again. And I do hope that you will come back to us more frequently, not at the very long gaps over which you have visited us. Chen is with the IIT Delhi, and his work is on the labor market and industrial economics. He kind of works at the junction of both. And it's actually quite pertinent that we are hearing Jen on this particular subject of research that he has been pursuing for quite some time, because for some odd reason, the demographic dividend that India used to be characterized with for quite some time, we don't hear much being spoken about the demographic dividend anymore. In fact, particularly all projections about India, the macroeconomic forecasting, so much of it, 25, 30 year long projections used to have this whole idea of the demographic dividend at the back of the conversation. It seems to have gone out of fashion. It seems to have lost its traction in some ways. But why has it? Because the reality hasn't changed in the sense that India still happens to be the largest young country of the world, holding almost 1/3 of the global population up to 30 years, 15 to 30, that level as Jen mentions here. And that's a sizable number. That's a sizable number which can be potentially influential in an economic way, in a social way, perhaps in a transformative way as well. But whether that is actually the basic idea with which we should live is something which probably we need to study a little bit more closely. Now, I think what Jen is going to speak on today is a part of his ongoing research. And this research connects to the population cohort that we just mentioned. It's basically the young population cohort. And probably in some respect, Jen, you'd be focusing on the sort of the ability of this population to contribute insofar as the broader economic growth and opportunities, but their ability to contribute will be in turn dependent upon the opportunities they get. Now, whether those opportunities would be coming to them through a market mechanism, or whether they are expected to create their opportunities, and whether the ecosystem is conducive for that, are, I think, some of the very important questions that we would be happy to learn from you more about insofar as ideas and possible answers are concerned. And it's also, I think, interesting that you are also going to broadly reflect upon some of the policies which are important for countries to be taken up in this regard, because we do see a lot of conversation happening around the labor market, but unfortunately, again, employment doesn't seem to be a central focus of the conversation anymore. People seem to have accepted the fact that employment will remain status quo. I mean, it will neither increase nor decrease. It will remain somewhere. So let it be pushed out of the political plate of ideas and, contestable ideas in that respect. So Jen, we'd love to hear your thoughts on these. It's over to you now, and please take your time, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, okay, whatever you prefer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amitendu, Divya, Professor Iqbal and others, part of the ISS team which organized this, and it's really truly a homecoming for me. Like I said, like was already mentioned, I was a part of ISS between 2005 and 2008. So it's going to be almost 20 years, so it's and also I'm very happy to meet some old friends, Ganesh and others. So I'm going to share the screen. I hope it's it. Oh, I have to share. Yeah. Is it okay? Okay. Yeah. So okay. So quickly the blue line is for China. Okay. So the blue line is for China. So what you see is the period 1980 to 2010 was a period of rising working age population for China. And also we remember this is the period in which China was clearly the main growth pole of the world economy. But you also see that after 2010, China's working age population is not just slowing down, it's actually going to have an absolute decline. The numbers after reaching 920 million is actually going to decline by a few hundred millions in the next few decades. Which also means that China's growth will face serious constraints in the coming years, which means, is it the turn of India? As you can see, India's working age population is going to increase. It has crossed the China's working age population in 2024. Now, well, I'm looking here at the next graph, which is mainly the 15 to 29. We talked about the 15 to 59, which is the working age population, the broad working age population. And these are all data from the World Bank. If you look at the 15 to 29, we find that the demographic window of opportunity for India, even for India, the young population is going to, the red line, I hope is the, so after 2040, you can see the red line after 2040, it is going to slow down. So it's got a very limited opportunity, and you will have other regions like South Asia, sub-Saharan African countries coming up in the coming years. Now, my research on labor market is in this larger context, which I just now described. A part of it is work on the supply of and demand for labor in India. This is mainly done with official employment statistics, that is the National Sample Survey on employment and unemployment. We had data from 1983 till 2011-12. After 2011-12, the next survey, employment survey, was 2017-18. It was called Periodic Labor Force Survey. It is a slightly different name. But each of these surveys, and you have annual data from 2017-18. Each of these surveys cover more than 100,000 households chosen from the different parts of the country in such a way that they are representative, which also means around 450,000 individuals. So you go to a household and ask each individual what each individual household member are doing. So you have this is official employment statistics. My colleagues and I also have done some field work, especially among internal migrant workers. And all this research has been guided by my larger teaching and research interests in macroeconomics for developing countries. My collaborators, some of the PhD students who have worked with me, and you can see the topics: equality or inequality, migration of workers, female participation in the labor force, agriculture and rural labor markets, manufacturing employment growth. These are some of the topics that have been done, and these are some of the ongoing projects. The earlier were most of the PhDs completed. Women's work, agrarian capitalism, a study of Jharkhand, migration from Odisha, migration from Bihar, domestic workers, shadow banking in India and China. So these are some of the topics that work with my collaborators. I also want to, I'm sure most of you in this group know this very well, but probably it's worth repeating, that the larger context is that in Indian industrialization after independence in 1950 was possibly a very important path-breaking, planned development using technology to change the economic structure. But there have been historically determined inequalities based on gender, caste, and while on the one hand we had this technological intervention, we also did not have any progressive social transformation, radical redistribution of land or other assets of the kind that many of the East Asian countries had, starting with Japan or China had land reforms. And underinvestment in education and health has been another feature of Indian development. So if you're looking at a long term, an industrial policy, I can come back to it later. While we started with planning in the 1950s, then the first 3 decades were marked by planning, probably too much of government intervention. The last few decades, especially after 91, was marked by an absence, a complete withdrawal of the government from industrial growth and absence of an industrial policy, not just slowing down of public investment, but an absence of industrial policy. So the question is, we have a growing supply of potential workers. So you have an increase in working age population, which is this natural growth. You also have shift away from workforce, which is a point I'm going to come, because 43% of India's workforce is still in agriculture, which is very, very high. 1% for the US, 25% for China. You expect any developing country, as with economic growth, the workforce to move away from agriculture. But for India, it still is quite a large number. But you also, at the same time, you have growing enrollment in education, which means higher aspirations. It's also a big potential. I can just come back to all these things. It's already mentioned. It's worth mentioning that while 43% plus is in agriculture, agriculture's share in output or value added is less than 15%. So you can imagine agriculture is a low productivity sector, and with respect to employment, agriculture is something like a residual sector where you don't really see unemployment, but you have very clear case of underemployment. Underemployment in the sense that productivity is very less. You can, in fact, many of these workers who say they are employed in agriculture can actually move out of agriculture without any reduction in income or output in agriculture. While we also know our small farm size is a problem, is both probably a problem, probably an opportunity. You can see the farm size. And also we must remember that a large part of India's rural population, there are farmers, small farmers, mostly small farmers, but you also have agricultural workers who do not own any land. So, so these are. Now, like I said, perhaps the most positive feature, if you look at the long-term development in the last few years, last few decades, a big change from the 2000s, in fact, is a growing enrollment in education. And you see, this is not just basic education. You can see female in the 5 to 14 age group. In 1983, only 40% of those in that age group were enrolled in any school. So, 60% were out of school, which was a very low number in 1983. Much ahead, the East Asian countries were much ahead. But now, if you look at the latest data, 2022, we find almost 97% are enrolled in a school. But even adult students, 15 plus, you see 30% of the adult students are enrolled in schools or colleges. The other thing to note is this narrowing of differences between men and women. And this is true even in rural areas. So this is a huge change. It's clearly, I believe it's a demand for education, even among the poor, and it's clearly a rise in aspirations. But are there enough facilities for affordable education is a question that we can talk about. If you just convert that point, which I just mentioned, that you have so many in enrollment, convert that into numbers, you get 121 million adult students. I mean, these are not all in higher education. Higher education numbers is something like 35 million, but 121 million, as you can all imagine, is a huge number. It's a huge potential for any kinds of knowledge economic growth in the knowledge economy. But are we is the economy creating enough jobs? I'm talking more about India, but much of these apply to the rest of South Asia. Is the economy creating enough jobs? I mean, of course, the numbers are there, but if I might just summarize with those, whatever is written in the red line at the bottom, manufacturing employment growth was somewhat stagnant. As you can see, it's kind of between 60 million except the latest figure actually shows some improvement, 67 million, something which we can probably, again, if interested, come back. Construction is a sector which was actually the main source of employment between 2004 and 2012, which is also a phase of very fast growth for the Indian economy. It's also a major source of poverty reduction because these are jobs for relatively less skilled people in rural areas. And the biggest gainers were people in rural areas in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and so on in between 2004 and 12. But after that, you can again see some kind of a leveling off in construction jobs as well. Professional activities, finance, IT, these are the better paid jobs, and these are the jobs which clearly the middle class, the new emerging middle class, young Indians want these jobs. And you can see a big increase also. 2004, 4.4 million, it increased to around almost a 20 million increase. It's a big number, as you can imagine, but given the size of India's population and the workforce, it's certainly not a big number. Professional administration, and it's kind of a stagnation. Government jobs, stagnation, which is in fact the reason for many of the current even political debates, as you probably may have seen. Education and health is a positive, another positive story, where you have very large substantial numbers of jobs generated, and many of these are for women. But overall, if you see, given given the magnitudes of people seeking jobs, there are not enough jobs. Now, what does that mean for especially the young? I mean, here we are looking at young in the sense of 15 to 29-year-old men in rural areas. So my system, yeah. Okay, so the bottom two is agriculture. So the blue is cultivators and the red is agricultural workers. So what you see here is in 1983, 15 to 29 young men, 60% were engaged in agriculture. The blue and the red together, almost 60%. These are young men. Many of them could have been students, but 60% were engaged in agriculture. They were either cultivators or they were agricultural workers. But that has changed. Now only 24%, less than 24% in the latest figure. What has increased? Students. Student proportion has increased, but you can also see, it was 12%, it increased to 39% in 2019. It declined to 33% in 23. That must be of interest. And in fact, even I do not know the reasons, but things can be asked. What I want to show you two other things. One is no major increase in regular employment. The regular employment is this brown. The brown remains, the size of the brown blocks remain almost the same over time. The other thing that may be of interest is the top, which is unemployment. You can also see that unemployment was stagnant and very low. I mean, these are not unemployment rates. These are unemployed as a proportion of population. Unemployment rates may be slightly higher. Slightly higher. But even then, you can see 3.3% of out of 100, less than 4 out of every 100 were unemployed. Part of the reason is, in fact, Amartya Sen has mentioned that India's unemployment rates can put developed countries to shame because it was largely underemployment. Like I already mentioned, I mean, it's a highly, low productivity agriculture because you are there because you may not have any other option. It was kind of a surplus sector. But you also see in recent times, unemployment becoming more open. And that is what you find, a large increase in unemployment among the young in rural areas in 2017-18 and 2018-19. In fact, there were a lot of debates, as you know, the 2017-18 data came just before the previous election, which showed this big jump in unemployment rate in India. There was some interesting debate on that, and we can of course come back. But I'm interested in the long-term picture, and if the long-term picture is on the one side, you have these young people, more educated people, but not enough regular jobs. That's the big picture I want to show. I can make this point again with this, a cohort of people, that is 15 to 24-year-olds in 2011-12. You can see the brown part, 56% of the young, 15 to 24, were attending an educational institution in 2011. 56%, which means all of them may have been looking for better jobs. All of those who are attending those educational institutions may have been looking for it. Now, what happened to them 10 years later? Now 10 years later, 15 to 24 will be 25 to 34-year-olds. We looked at the 25 to 34-year-olds in 2022, and we find only one-third, only around 40% of those who are students found some regular employment with some social security. The rest could not. So that is the other. Now, when it comes to women, we find a different phenomenon, which is there is again very similar problems. We have very large absence of jobs, absence of enough job opportunities. But what you don't really find unemployment again here. You don't also find, in the case of men, mostly men finding jobs as casual workers or as self-employed in low-wage jobs, low-wage sectors. In the case of women, we find a different phenomenon, which is a very large proportion of women. As you can see, close to 45% of all women in this young age group reporting their status as attending domestic duties in their own household. So you have what is described as a withdrawal of the women from the labor force, partly because of the same reasons, which is that no significant increase in regular jobs. Again, you find the same phenomenon in the case of women, except that you had, so it's again very similar in, you have women also attending educational institutions in almost equally large enough numbers. So the aspirations, when it comes to education, that is, like I said, that is the big positive change that has happened over the decades. Equally, men and women, almost equal numbers attending educational institutions. But after education, what? That's the question. For men, many of them, I mean, at least 60% of them have to find jobs which may not be to their satisfaction. In the case of women, a large part who attended educational institutions actually drop out of the labor force. And that is what you see, this, domestic duties, the blue blocks, very high there. Women's participation, low participation in the labor force, as you can see, China's is 68, Bangladesh is 66, India's was, at least at one point in time, it was less than 25%. Is much again a subject of much debate and both academic and policy discussion. One of the reasons I already mentioned, but again, like I already mentioned, the job generation is low, but within that job generation, women's share is particularly low. Oh, I didn't. This hasn't moved. Okay, this has moved now. Again, sorry for this. Too many. Probably the big tables are not. But you can see those marked in red. Professional activities. Women, it is essentially, if you look at the last column, professional activity, you see less than 20% of those employed in IT, finance, and those modern activities are women. That shouldn't be the case. I mean, we shouldn't probably, women could be employed in equal numbers. Even government jobs, less than 20% are women. So clearly, the jobs are not too many. That is the main issue. We must also note that I mentioned historically determined disadvantages. People, social communities, scheduled castes or Dalits, scheduled tribes or Adivasis, they have faced disadvantages, communities, and those disadvantages have also translated into the labor market, and that is what you see here. Workers belonging to the disadvantaged communities, more of them are in casual jobs, and fewer of them are in regular jobs compared to people, persons who belong to the other community or the general community. We have done a study on migrant workers. We've been doing a study which is surveyed close to 500 workers with my colleagues at IIT Delhi, many of them. many points to note here, but I just want to mention 2 points. One is I already mentioned, the jobs, the numbers are not, there is a problem with the numbers, but the wages that workers receive is also another issue. Rupees 500, which translate into $6 US dollars for 12 hours of work. And this is a worker, the picture I showed you is a worker from Bihar, 23-year-old, and they're working in Ludhiana in Punjab. So there's migration from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and other regions to, you can see the map of, again, maybe not needs no introduction here, but then from the north and east of India, which are the more populous states and also probably less developed in terms of per capita income. There have been this migration initially to Punjab, then to the west, which is Maharashtra, Gujarat, but now increasingly to the south. Kerala, Tamil Nadu have become major destination. As you can see, it's several hundreds of kilometers away. But then the work is long hours of work, and so these are workers again. This is largely the informal sector. Again, this is a very residual sector in India, just like agriculture. You are there because you don't have any other option. Mostly men, the workers we interviewed, mostly young or middle-aged, and they suffer from multiple disadvantages because many of them belong to social groups that are socially disadvantaged, scheduled castes, Muslims. They do not own land or other assets in the village, poor education and skills. I must also mention that absence of social security, which is a feature of in the Indian context. You don't have even, in fact, the coverage of public distribution of food and all is also very not universal, or free provision of education and health you do not have. So that is, so when it comes to the migrant workers, these internal migrant workers who they do not get social security in the villages they come from, and that is one reason why they actually migrate. But they do not get any social security in the towns or the cities to which they migrate, because the workers actually belong to a state. The state government there may not have, may not be providing food and other social security. But again, I should mention that these are just a breakdown of expenditures. So when you 500 rupees per day translate into something like 12,000 rupees per month, which is a very low income for a family of, let's say, 4 people to live without, you have to pay rent, you have to pay electricity charges, you have to pay education expenses, and you also send remittances. Even if you are staying with your family, you still send remittances to your larger household members. But perhaps the positive thing I want to show is, despite your low incomes, you spend a lot of your income on education, which shows the aspirations. At the same time, we have a new consumption expenditure survey released very recently. It raises questions as to whether the workers are getting enough, given the low amount. I mean, you're spending around 45% on food, but 4,500 for the entire family for food, is that enough for nutrition? Now, coming back to my final phase, and this is exports as a proportion of GDP. You can see that China's growth and East Asia's growth, let's say from 1990 to 2010, was one where exports was growing very fast. Of course, India and the rest of South Asia never had that kind of an export-driven growth. But many argue that India and South Asian countries will have that possibility. Exports can be the driver of growth. But unfortunately, we must understand that the demand, where will the demand come from? The demand for East Asia and China, the export demand came mainly from the West, from the US, from other Western European countries. But that demand is likely to slow down, partly because of stagnation in the West, partly because of aging population, not just in the West, but also in East Asia. Now, which also means that future growth has to come more from the region. And in fact, this is a new phase of growth. In fact, quite different from the East Asian if you look at the South Asian growth, it certainly cannot be, export cannot be the main engine of growth as it had been in the case of East Asian, or it's quite more difficult. Now, if you think that growth will be more based on domestic incomes and not export, we have to make sure that wage incomes have to increase. So there has to be domestic incomes. I mean, people within the country should be able to spend. People within South Asia should be able to spend. Within economics, there's this very large debate, but I can probably go very quickly on this. I'll take under 5 minutes, perhaps. That's more. The typical argument, especially from the mainstream economics, is that wages is a component of cost, and you should try to reduce the cost, which means you should try to reduce wages. But there is a problem. If you think your demand is going to come from wage incomes, from people spending within your country, then wages will be a source of demand, will be a source of growth. And in fact, business can gain from rising wage incomes and aggregate demand. In fact, what we should then look for is to raise the consumption of an investment for the poor. And we just mentioned of course, it's very difficult to ask the businesses to increase the wages. Voluntarily, they may not do it. But one way to do it is to increase social spending by the government. We just mentioned how workers in Ludhiana spend more than 20% of their very little income on education. So if education is provided free, if there is subsidized housing, you can imagine your real wages, although your nominal wages still remain at 10,000 rupees, your real wages can increase. So that is a possibility. It is important to note here that if you just look at the investment rates, investment as a share of GDP, the first phase of India's and kind of similar South Asia's, the first economic growth was 2004 to 12, and that was also a period of rising investment rates. And you can see at one point in time, the red and the blue overlap. In fact, the red, which is India, was even higher than China's. So India was investing more than 40% of its GDP, investing in machines. But what happened after 2012 is a fall in investment rates. In fact, the responses to the global financial crisis of 2008, China's response was to increase investment further. Of course, there was criticisms on that, whether you are investing too much into all these highways and renewable energy and new areas of growth. But India's response was possibly even worse, which was to reduce investment, which is what you see here is not just public, but also private investment. It has never recovered. It is kind of remaining stagnant around 30%. So the question is, what can government spending do? And I think I will very quickly go through it, because I already in fact, government spending can do a lot in reviving industrial growth. We need an industrial policy. I can come back to each of these later. But social expenditures, particularly spending on education, health. And one point I want to mention is your huge unmet demand for higher education, for instance. 2 million candidates writing the entrance exam for medical, less than 3% getting admission. Definitely, if you have more colleges, if you have more teachers, you can have more health professionals, doctors, nurses coming out of these colleges in India. I will just summarize the last 2 minutes, perhaps. So my argument is the following. If future growth is to be derived more from domestic market and less from the export growth, which was the case in East Asia and China, we need rising wages and not stagnant wages. But unfortunately, that is not the case now in India. We also need an upgrading of industrial structure. It's one thing to say you need higher wages, but then you also need higher value coming from our industries, which means you have to move from industries that are built entirely on cheap labor to industries that gain from innovation, to industries, modern industries. Of course, all this should happen along with an upgrading of human resources. You need more improvements in health, higher education in particular, which is, India already have a substantial investment in higher education, but we are a very young country now. Public expenditures in social sectors already mentioned can boost real wages, but industrial policy and public spending on research and development is something which again I can come back if there is time. Well, I didn't talk much about South Asia, the rest of South Asia, other South Asian countries, but I understand my limited research on those countries. I understand the problems are very similar. You again need massive improvements, health, higher education, human resources. Industrial structure needs to be diversified. I mean, even the countries which are doing well, for instance, Bangladesh, much of it is coming from a single industry, one or two industries, like garments. So dependence on one or two industries is problematic. But I guess when it comes to the rest of, we need regional economic alliances of the kind that facilitated growth in East Asia. We also need greater movement of goods and services, as well as of people across the region, because South Asia has the potential to emerge as the most dynamic pole of the global economy, as the population numbers I showed at the very beginning. It's clear that our future relations should not be guided by geostrategic concerns, but by the possible economic gains and massive improvements in livelihood and social mobility for young South Asians. But of course, all these need greater spending by the government and a new consensus among economies, some of which it is happening. It's a make or break moment, because it's 2040, by 2045, your demographic window of opportunity will be all over. So, I mean, if the government has to spend on higher education, spend now. I mean, don't have to wait, don't have to think that, there is a fiscal challenge, fiscal constraint. The argument is you save first, and the typical mainstream economic argument is that you save first and then you spend. That doesn't work now, because you have very limited time. You spend first and saving will follow. But I think I can come back to all of these points. Thank you so much for this. This is all I have to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen, for taking us through that very exhaustive set of issues. The labor market is always a complex area to navigate, and thank you for bringing up so many issues. I'm quite sure we have questions from colleagues. So Ronojoy, Ganesh, Puspa, and then on my right, Divya. Okay, in that order, Ronojoy, please.
Thanks, Jan, for the talk. I had a very quick question on a couple of the data and slides that you mentioned. One was, one of the positive aspects that you mentioned was when we were looking at the employment pattern, that there is a rise in people in the who are in the education, who are opting to get educated, and also when you talked about the spending of the migrant workers, you saw a larger share of expenditure on the education. But one of the questions I had, and others have commented on it, is the quality of education, right? So if you look at things like the ASER, the annual status of education report, which is on primary and elementary education, you see that the quality of education in India is actually abysmal. People probably know barely how to read and write, but both the literacy skills as well as other skills like numeracy skills are subpar compared to. So that's something I just wanted your comment. And also if you look at the higher education, one of the things we noted is that there's been an expansion of institutes, right? So you are at one of the original IITs, right? But when you look at the more recent, say, IITs or even the IIMs, you find that the quality is not the same as the ones that go back to the pioneer ones from the 50s and 60s, because there's also an issue of who do you go to teach there, right? There's a shortage of. So you could just say a little bit about both these issues. Thanks.
Quickly answer. Yeah. So thank you, Ronojoy, for that. And yeah, I very well. In fact, quality of education is a big problem. And but yeah, on the positive, I must emphasize again. Remember, 83, only 40% were, especially among women, were attending at an educational institution among the young women, very less than 14 years old. But that has changed. So there is a realization, a broad realization, rural areas among women, that education is important. I guess that is a big positive change. Of course, this was a change which should have happened 2 or 3 decades back, which clearly gives an opportunity for the governments at various levels to provide high quality basic and higher education. But unfortunately, that realization, I believe, hasn't happened, because our basic, we had a long record of investment in higher education. The IITs were started in the 1950s and the 1960s, which of course turned out to be world-class institutions. But even in the earlier decades, 1950s onward, our investment in basic education this is a point which Amartya Sen always mentioned, was quite low. But now we have to invest much more on basic education, but we also have to invest on higher education, because the enrollment for higher education is also much bigger now, and coming from a much larger social base. Earlier, probably higher education was limited to those who are from the disadvantaged categories, social categories. But now the demand for higher education is across. But even there, if you have looked at the numbers, spending, it is not has not increased. Within higher education, a large part of the expenditures go to some of these elite institutions. Education is partly in the state government, but this is clearly an opportunity. This is clearly an opportunity for governments at both levels, at the state and the central level, and perhaps at the lower levels, to invest in this. So yes, I think education is going to be the key determinant whether India and South Asia are going into the next level of economic growth, because you have so many people waiting for that education. You just need to provide that education. Yeah, but I can of course come back with other.
Ganesh?
Thank you. It's really very nice to hear, very nice to hear focus on labor and focus on youth particularly. And, so I had one or two thoughts. One is really, what is the skill development story? Because, you are looking at education, you're looking at enrollment at school level, then the dropout rates, the small percentage which stays in education in the university level, tertiary level. So one has heard a lot about skill development in the last 15 years, but what really has it really translated to in something tangible in terms of the youth and their ability to be employable? That's one question. The other is, what is the regional story in this? So for example, one sees a very high number. This is of course, based on impressions during travel to different places. For example, you find a lot of people from the Northeast in places like Bangalore, in the South, far away places, now in the, working, no longer confined to the Northeast, but looking for opportunities elsewhere. So is there a regional story in this? And likewise, as you said, I found in Kerala, the people from Bihar working as security guards and all that kind of thing. So the regional dimension. The third is there a sort of, in this larger scenario that you've drawn, is there a sort of some grounds for hope? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ganesh, for those. These are again points which I wanted to talk about. Skill development story is clearly a puzzle, because on the one hand, you see these numbers, rising enrollment. You would expect naturally, because if you just go by the numbers, you would naturally expect a very high proportion of people highly skilled and waiting for jobs. But the industry's complaint over the last decade or so has been, you don't get enough skilled workers. Clearly puzzle. You have a very labor surplus country. Why is that happening? I guess part of the reason is also, in fact, part of the blame should also go to the industry itself, I believe, because we have done, some of my collaborators have done study on the garment industry. Why India is lagging behind, clearly behind China, but also behind Bangladesh and Vietnam in the garment industry. You don't have, typically the garment industry now is very large factories employing, let's say, 10,000 workers. But large proportion of factories in India are still the small factories. So the argument by the work that we did showed that perhaps there is this continued dependence on cheap workers, cheap labor is available. So you don't really have to go up the ladder, because to move up even within a labor intensive industry such as garments, which is, everywhere it is built on low wages, is clearly a characteristic of this industry anywhere in the world. But even within that industry, you don't really want to go up a little higher, because to go up that ladder means you have to invest in people, you have to probably train them, you have to probably provide them some minimum security of employment, and so on and so forth. So that is, I believe, one of the factors, because if you are not providing jobs, if there is not enough demand for skill, there will not be any clear supply of skill. So I think that is one. The regional story and your second and third questions, I remember because we interviewed these workers, migrant workers in Ludhiana in 2022, immediately after, these COVID restrictions were removed, and some of these workers had spent a few weeks or months in their native villages. So many of them have come back from Uttar Pradesh or Bihar. And one of the comments made by a worker, actually still quite striking comment. What he said was, UP, the village, the district I come, there is enough land. If these industries had moved to my district, I wouldn't have to come back. They were clearly not happy coming back, because you're leaving your family, your larger family, and you are living, of course, your very poor existence in a city which is quite different. Certainly not the city that you grew up in. So I think that requires, so clearly we need a regional distribution of industrial growth, has to be very different. Much of it is, earlier Punjab had an advantage in the garment industry. Ludhiana had the early green revolution. These were the early green revolution states, so industrial growth happened in those regions. But now, of course, we can move these industries to new regions where where you have greater labor supply. But that requires clearly an industrial policy by governments at various levels. I think that is one. In fact, there is another story to it. If you look at Kerala, or for that matter Punjab, you also find many of the workers coming from the region who studied in Kerala, who studied in Punjab, they are actually migrating out of the respective states. So you have, on the one hand, you have migration of probably more educated workers to the cities or to the rest of the world. In fact, many workers from Kerala, many will go to foreign countries. But you also have an in-migration so your industrial structures have to actually suit your regional, resources, your competitive advantages in the sense. If your region is one where you have more educated labor, then you should be able to shift to more knowledge-based industries. But that is not an easy thing. You have to make investments. You have to have planning. So different regions in India will have to have different industrial policies. So is there a hope? I believe yes. And I always see, the last 14 years I've been teaching at IIT. I probably mentioned this in my earlier. You have a much greater socially diverse, students coming from more diverse backgrounds. Earlier, probably it was more from a smaller proportion, but now you have students and young people coming from a diverse background, from different regions, many coming from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. So I see this as a positive sign. It's still a young country, although you may not remain young forever. So I find positives. Thank you. You also had
Sorry. Thank you. I think that was very interesting. And as you said, the focus is on India, but then we might have the same, situation in other countries. I come from Nepal. And I can see that this resonates with Nepal's case as well. In fact, even worse, like in agriculture, more than 60% of the population directly and indirectly is engaged in agriculture, whereas the contribution to GDP is around 20%, 20 to 23%. So there's a lot of underemployment or like disguised employment. So there is a need for people to come out of agriculture, right? So agriculture possibly is not the sector where more employment can be generated. Actually, we have to move people out of the agriculture, which means the other sectors have to be the competitive ones, the rising ones where more employment needs to be generated. But then the question also comes like in terms of technological advances and the competitiveness that the countries are facing in almost every sector, whether, I mean, and I think this relates to the earlier discussion also, whether the skills that our people are getting out of this education, it's suitable for them to be absorbed into these other sectors in terms of making the sectors competitive itself. And perhaps the reason, one reason I would assume, as Dr. Palit also said, like, why is the labor thing not coming up so highly? Maybe that could, is it a reason that our labor force is being absorbed in some way by other countries? You looked into internal migration, but what about the external migration factor? Because external migration is a huge thing for all the South Asian countries. Like in absolute numbers, India is the highest remittance receiving country. In terms of GDP figures, I'm like comparison to GDP, Nepal is one of the highest remittance receivers. So in terms of the window that we have, and a reason why perhaps the government are not so concerned about it is perhaps because the other countries are making our government's job easier by taking these labors. And given the rising, age even outside, I don't know if this is going to fall anytime soon. So if that is the case, and if this labor is going to be absorbed abroad, perhaps South Asian countries' job is a bit easier in terms of creating jobs. And my second observation is on the wage part. And this also, I think, is about the open economies that we are in. See, as you said, I mean, rising wages would create more demand, and that would be good for the manufacturing and other sectors. But perhaps we might also have to look at which sectors, because with rising wages, if there is a rising demand, but that demand will be catered by imports rather than domestic manufacturing, then that will not go well with the domestic manufacturers, right? So there might be a demand increase, but for imports. So how can we perhaps tackle that problem is also an issue that the governments might have to look into. Thank you.
I must first of all say, well, you take up your question about external migration. I think I'm not that pessimistic about external migration, but just look at the numbers. No, I just want to emphasize this point. 122 million we have adult students in 2023. You can imagine, no? What is the population of Singapore? Like, so even if you let's say 1% of adult students go abroad, I don't think it's such a brain drain. I mean, in fact, I think there can be many positives from that. These are, let's say 1%. They could be some of the better students who received better education. It's fine, let them go abroad, but they can also bring back their experiences. But the larger point is you have many more if you can provide quality education to this. So I think while on the one side we provide high quality education, and a large part of it has to be more public education, I must say, because many of these students who are coming into the education system now are people who cannot afford a higher education. So if you only make affordable higher education, or if you make higher education affordable to these newer entrants to the higher education, at the same time you have these external migrants. In fact, try benefit from that. We have, again, one of the positives is that there's a startup scene now. Startup firms have been doing very well. So startup sector is high technology industries is one where you can have easily collaborations with, you have somebody workers in Singapore with Indian connections. They can link up with young students in the IITs or in any of these engineering colleges. Or so I think if we can build institutions, and we can also have government putting in money into high quality higher education for all, things can be turned around. This can be positive. On agriculture and rising wages, I think the possibilities for increasing value added in agriculture and rural areas is huge, immense. I live in Delhi, and I know many of the fruits and vegetables come from neighboring states like Himachal Pradesh. By the time it reaches the Delhi markets, a part of it is you don't have storage facilities, you don't have good transportation facilities, you don't have good processing higher value added products from agriculture. We are now the largest milk producer in the world. India is now one of the largest, the largest milk producer in the world. But the kind of products that, like, say, a country like Australia makes. So I guess I know I understand your concern that if you don't act well, the demand within rural areas will be met by imports. That should not happen. And that is again where I feel industrial policy will have a role to play. We have a lot to learn. South Asian countries, all South Asian countries have a lot to learn from East Asia, including Singapore. The way East Asian countries build high technology industries. In fact, it doesn't have to be high technology industries. Even industries, let's say food processing, it's not rocket science, it's not very high technology, but it requires new processes, new methods. So the way, a lot to learn, and I think that is what I would, in fact, there's a lot of discussion on industrial policy at the global level. We really need to think on those lines.
Jen, before I ask Divya a question, let's come back to this point of the food industry. There's been a point that has been mentioned by Singapore agencies for quite some time, over the last 1.5 to 2 years, that one of the experiences during the COVID-19 was that Singapore, as a small economy, and given the kind of geography that it has around it, it's been very open to imports. It's been very active in sourcing food, and both semi-finished and finished food. But nonetheless, it feels the imperative to diversify food sourcing much more. And one of the countries it is looking at closely in this regard is India. And you specifically mentioned the dairy sector. So that's probably one sector where the imperative for building closer connections, and it's not just in form of bilateral sourcing, but maybe in terms of a wider regional food supply chain that might work. And I thought this complements your idea pretty interestingly. So I'll be happy to hear your thoughts on that at some stage. In the meantime, Divya, please go ahead.
So a major takeaway from the presentation is that you propose that government spending in welfare activities can help increase wages. I couldn't help but think, given the current state of South Asian countries, many of which have very tight balance sheets, you see the debt GDP ratios very not in a very desirable state. How do you see that play out, particularly in India's context? Added to that is that most of these welfare activities are state specific sort of subjects. So I would just like to hear your thoughts on how this dichotomy can be handled.
Thank you, Divya. 2 points. One, social spending, will it create a fiscal crisis? You mentioned states. In fact, you have experience within India. Some states have actually taken the initiative. Kerala, for instance, it actually, I've looked at the budget documents of Kerala, and as early as 1960, Kerala was spending almost 50% of its entire budget on health and education. Entire state budget. Now, over the years, Kerala made very important progress in social sectors, health, education. Now, of course, it is not a complete story. I mean, you still do not create enough jobs, modern jobs within the state, which is why a large number of people from this state actually go out of the country to find jobs. But, I think, has it created a crisis? No. Economic growth has actually benefited by spending on health and education. In fact, many other states have followed over the years, like Tamil Nadu immediately after Kerala, Himachal Pradesh. And in fact, I have a slide which shows in recent times, many state governments have increased their expenditures on health and education, which is clearly a positive sign. Now, there is always this concern in India, will it lead to a fiscal crisis? Will it lead to some countries like in the region, South Sri Lanka really went through a crisis, which is where I think I would like to bring more macroeconomics into this. So we teach, the Keynesian idea in macroeconomics is that, saving is not a fixed pool. So when you think you're going into a crisis, because you think that saving is a fixed pool, saving is limited. But saving is something which can increase. You spend on education. When you spend on education, you have people with higher qualifications. Those higher qualifications can create more incomes, it can create more consumption in the economy. More incomes means more saving. So, you don't really have to think, you don't have to limit yourself. You spend first. In fact, that is the entire Keynesian idea. You spend first and then saving will follow. Whereas countries like India, where you have a productive potential, you have a young population. If you have an aging population, of course, this may not work, because you have a limit, you have a fiscal limit. Maybe it is not easy for you to increase your income, but that is not the case when you have a young population. And these people are waiting for opportunities, waiting for higher education opportunities, waiting for better job opportunities. So I would say the government can spend more, and it has to spend much more, given the short window that we are talking about. I think I answered.
Coming from one of your former students, Jen, I think you got off quite lightly on that.
Thank you.
I was expecting her to
ask me more. Yeah, I know.
more
It's
probing
quite a
and more.
debated, highly debated. I know.
Anyway, no worries. More questions? Go ahead, Seth.
So I think education within migrant laborers' expenditure was a big chunk of their expenditure. So I was wondering if that kind of translated into a politically salient issue for them. If in your interaction with them you came across how, because education in terms of how it plays out in the political discourse is not very consistent all the time. So I was just wondering, when it comes to migrant laborers in your interactions, did you find that it was a salient issue in those terms, and what their political expectations or those were around it?
Well, of course, I will certainly make my writings available to you. So we have written about migration also. Whether it is, I don't think, see, migrant workers typically do not, because you are in a different state and you do not raise the voice is limited. You are a migrant worker because your voice is limited. And because of which there are places where, in Ludhiana also, some of the workers manage to send their children to a government school. But as was already mentioned, the quality of higher basic education also is not always up to the mark. So these parents, while sending their children to a government school, also spend money on private tuition. So they certainly expect better facilities for basic education, forget higher education, but that is not always forthcoming. Yes, there will be discontent, but it's not always. It certainly, migrant workers, you don't see any kind of unionization because it's a very floating workforce. You have workers coming, they go back. There's a lot of movements. In fact, during the COVID time, there was a bus service all the way from Kerala to Assam and West Bengal. You can imagine, no? Several hundreds of kilometers, 3-4 days. So there's what I'm trying to say is there's a frequent movement. So it's workers are very temporary. They stay in one place for a few months. Let's say within Kerala, even within Kerala, you move a lot. So yeah, so for many of these workers, only the men migrate and the families stay back in the villages. So it's the education within, in the respective states, education in West Bengal or so that matters. But for many of the workers in Ludhiana, some of them were second generation workers. So they were there for a long time. Many of them were staying with their families. For them, education and other social security measures from Punjab is crucial, but again, certainly workers demand more. They want more. But I can give you more details later.
If there are no more questions, Jen, I wanted to have your thoughts on something, and this is taking a slightly broader, canvas on the subject. We see the question of employment, and again, I'm being very India specific in this regard. We see the question of employment actually getting a number of manifestations in the social and sort of socio-economic discourse. So there is clearly a degree of frustration among the young people, and that is often manifesting in unrest, agitation, so on and so forth. When we look at the other side, the public policy response or the state response, we essentially see two responses. One is that there is a recourse to what we typically call the public welfare populist measures. So there is an effort to probably, handle out subsistence in terms of income supports and so on and so forth, and that intensified after COVID. To the extent that that probably has had an impact on labor supply, in the sense you mentioned this very significant sector, construction. And construction probably has had a very late takeoff after COVID, because the labor has been reluctant to return. A lot of people who were engaged over there are reluctant to come back and work in the urban areas in construction projects, because they're kind of settled in their own occupation. The second tendency on part of the establishment, and particularly the political establishment, has been to go as local as possible and carve out reservations. So you do get to see local reservations surfacing in a very big way as far as the state governments are concerned. What I wanted to check from you is that none of these are basically connecting to this broader economic idea that we know, that there should be an effort on part of the state to bring out the labor in as much of an engaging occupation as possible, so that they can contribute productively, and that contributes to economic growth. Perhaps in some ways this fits into the wage idea that you proposed, that there is an increase in wages, there is an income, so that contributes to the consumption part of the society, but it's not really going to contribute to the economic momentum as such. That's my understanding. But given that India is headed into its next general elections in about a few weeks' time, what's your sense? That do you see this tendency of the populist support perpetuating over time, because there are no other public policy answers to the question of employment?
Thank you, Amitabh. In fact, you're right, very right. I have looked at the data. In fact, I have a slide, I can show it later, of an increasing spending on social sectors by state governments and also by the center in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. So you have food subsidy,
right?
A very large increase in food subsidy. And I believe it is possibly is the right step, because it was a crisis, and as I mentioned, I think this is spending. Food is a basic right. This is something which we should have ensured long back. But as you can imagine, the recent increase in spending on food and all that will certainly have political implications. You can imagine that. But on the other side, the absence of modern jobs and not having a plan for, how to build modern industries, how to create more modern jobs in the modern sectors. That is a clear problem, if not now, but definitely in the long run. And let's say even reservation for government jobs, but you also see that the number of government jobs have not increased over time.
Yeah.
It's kind of stuck for several decades. So this is one. So you have very limited number of government jobs, and the whole reservation. Then you have to to compete between communities for those limited pool. But one thing can be done is to increase the number of, at least say, government jobs, because it's very easy to and very much needed. You need so many more jobs as teachers in government schools. You need so many more professors. You need so many more health. It was very clear during the pandemic. Health professionals, doctors, nurses. You need a very large government, it's a very large country. You need many more government officers. Any state, if you go, many of the IAS officers, they have to handle multiple sectors, which is certainly not good for, in the long term administration. So yeah, I think that is what is needed. We how to reinvigorate the productive sectors, while the spending on social sectors, the spending on food is certainly a step in the right direction, and perhaps a step we should have taken even earlier. This is where the action is needed for the future. How to productive and modern sectors. Wage, low wage. I just want to probably coming to an end. I remember while I was in Singapore, one of the, in fact, I've written an article on that about Singapore's development in the earlier decades. So 1973, just a few years after Singapore was formed, there was a statement by the Singapore Minister of Foreign Industry at that time, which essentially said, we don't want low wage industries in this country. Yeah, we don't want, we want like furniture making or, some of those old traditional industries which were characterized by low wage, which essentially meant that you need to have, what the minister was effectively saying, we need to have a plan for modern industries. This is in 1973. This was in 1973, which clearly marked Singapore's transition into electronics and all the modern industries that we see today. Yeah. So you take any of these, whether it's South Korea, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Singapore, the planning was clearly a very important part of this industrial transformation. And that is where I mentioned that after 91, we don't have an industrial plan. We kind of wrongly believe that globalization and planning do not exist together. But in fact, in a globalized economy, you need to plan much more, because probably the investment is not going to come from the government. But when the investment is going to come from the private sector, that is when the planning has to be much more. We have to invite the right type of industries. You have to invite the right industrialists into the country. So that is where I think we are missing. So low wage to high wage is certainly a possibility. And I'm very optimistic about that. For a country like India with huge amount of skills, the entire South Asian region, we can easily, the transformation which East Asia did in the 1970s and 80s, we can easily do that now. But we need an industrial policy.
Any final questions from anybody? Okay, so if not, then Jen, thank you so much, because I understand you're in a family trip to Singapore, but thank you so much for taking time out. I do hope, and I think all my colleagues will agree with me, that we really have benefited from this insight. We don't get an opportunity to go deep into the dynamics of the labor market, because it's a subject that I think people somehow have developed a tendency to avoid because of the difficulty in reaching answers. But I think unless we keep hitting at the issues, we will not be able to develop even the clarity on the complications and the issues that are involved. So thank you so much for those insights, and we would look forward to this particular publication. Once it comes out, we'll be very happy to share this with us. All the very best. And today is Holi in India, so take the opportunity to wish you a very happy Holi, everybody, from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitendu. Thank you all, and again wishing you all a happy Holi. And
Thank you so much.
thank you.